I thought I had the perfect family, until one day, my wife's betrayal and my daughter's shocking response shattered everything I believed in. What happened next took me on a journey I never expected, one filled with heartbreak, resilience, and a chance at redemption. I thought I played a decent round, not my best ever, but solid. I finished 18 holes with a score of 7 over par, which was respectable by my standards these days. For the past few years, my friend Mike and I have made it a habit to play golf together a couple of times a month. Mike is about 10 years older than me, and we hit it off shortly after my wife, Amy, and I moved into our neighborhood 6 years ago. Mike's a big guy with an endless supply of stories. He's one of those people who can talk to anyone about anything. He works in real estate and does well for himself, although like anyone in the business, he goes through quieter times. His wife, Lisa, is a tall, slender blonde who stayed home to raise their son, Tyler. Tyler recently turned 18 and is finishing up high school before heading off to college. Amy and Lisa became fast friends after we moved in and started spending time together several times a week. My wife, Amy, is also blonde with straight hair that usually sits just right, though she sometimes curls it when she wants a bit more volume. Her hair falls just below her shoulders, and she takes care of herself. Sure, there are a few soft spots here and there, she's 41, after all, but to me, she's still the most stunning woman I've ever known. At least, that's how I felt before everything started to unravel. Guys, you know how it is when your wife says, "We need to talk." There's nothing quite as anxiety-inducing as hearing those words, and they've never once meant good news for the poor husband on the receiving end. When Amy said those words to me that Saturday afternoon, I immediately felt my stomach tighten. My mind raced to figure out what it could be. I hadn't gone into the garage, so my first thought was something happened to her car. But no, that wouldn't explain the serious look on her face. It was something bigger, something I wasn't ready to face yet. I've done well for myself as an engineer, so if the issue was something tangible, like a broken appliance or a car repair, I knew it wouldn't be a problem to fix. Amy was aware of that too, which made me think this wasn't about something material. My mind quickly shifted to something more personal, like family. All of our parents were still with us, as were 3 out of our 8 grandparents. Could something have happened to one of them? Or maybe it was about our daughter, Emma. Emma is incredibly close to her mom, and we've always joked that she's a mini-me version of Amy. She has her mom's straight blonde hair and, unfortunately for me, the same enthusiasm for shopping. Recently, Emma had started dating, a big milestone. She turned 18 a couple of months ago and introduced us to her boyfriend, Ryan. He seemed like a decent enough guy from what I could tell, though I couldn't claim to know much about their relationship. I didn't think there was anything physical between them, but let's be honest, fathers aren't always the first to know these things. Could Emma be pregnant? The idea hit me like a punch to the gut. It would explain Amy's somber tone. But it wasn't the end of the world, it could be dealt with. Then another thought struck me, what if it wasn't Emma? What if Amy was pregnant? Becoming a dad again at this point in my life wasn't something I'd ever considered. I loved raising Emma, and I figured my days of late-night feedings and diaper changes were behind me. Still, I wasn't opposed to the idea, though maybe Amy was worried I wouldn't feel the same way. All of these thoughts raced through my mind in a matter of seconds as I sat down across from Amy at the kitchen table. She looked at me with a mix of seriousness and hesitation that made my heart pound. "Dan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you know how much I love you, right?" "Of course, Amy." "I've never doubted it for a second," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. I didn't want her to feel nervous about sharing what I now felt sure was news about a new baby. But doubt crept into the back of my mind. Why would she preface this with a question about her love for me unless she was about to tell me something that might make me doubt it? "I do, Dan," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "I love you with all my heart and soul. I always have, and I always will. I look forward to spending the rest of my life with you." That's what I want too, Amy, I replied, though uneasiness was starting to set in. This conversation wasn't shaping up to be the joyful announcement I'd imagined. She reached out and held my hand, her expression serious yet tender. Dan, we've been together for 20 years. 18 of those as husband and wife. I nodded, unsure of what to say. My pulse quickened as I waited for the other shoe to drop. Amy, she began, her voice low and measured, I love you more and more every day. For the past 18 years, I've happily devoted my life to you and Emma. I've taken care of our family and asked for almost nothing for myself, except for the occasional visit with friends. Wouldn't you agree? Her words made it clear this wasn't about Emma. This was about her. It sounded like Amy had been holding back on something she wanted, something she assumed I might oppose. But another child? That theory was slipping through my fingers, it didn't seem likely anymore. Yes, I said cautiously, you've always put Emma and me first. She nodded and gave me a small, tight smile. Then, the next words out of her mouth hit me like a hammer. I need to tell you something, Dan. There's someone I see a couple of times a week, she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. But it's not what you think. I don't love him. I only love you. I sat frozen, the air sucked out of the room as her words sunk in. She didn't stop. I've tried my hardest to make sure you never found out. I didn't want anything to change for you or for us at home. I know your moods, Dan. I planned everything carefully. You've always had me whenever you wanted me, and that's not going to change. You're my husband, and your needs will always come first. Her words were a jumbled mess in my head. My wife, the woman I had shared my life with for 2 decades, was calmly telling me she had been seeing someone else. My stomach twisted as I forced myself to respond. So, you intend to keep doing this? I managed to ask, though my voice barely felt like my own. Yes, she said without hesitation. As I've said, my needs have increased. This arrangement helps me meet them. But it doesn't affect you or Emma. It's not something that has to change our life together. I was reeling, but somehow, she kept talking. The only reason I'm telling you now, she continued, is because I plan to spend every single day of the rest of my life proving to you how much I love you. And I want to thank you for letting me do this one thing for myself. My mind was spinning, but her next words pulled me back sharply. There's just one exception I want to ask for, she said, her tone suddenly hopeful. He wants to take me to Hawaii for a week. It would be like a celebration of the anniversary of our first date. That's all I'm asking for. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You can't be serious, I said, my voice laced with disbelief. You want me to just sit at home, working to support you, while you run off to Hawaii with your lover? How do you expect me to agree to something like that? Dan, it wouldn't change anything, she said softly, as though she couldn't understand my frustration. It's just 1 week. Then everything will go back to normal. Nothing between us has to change. I stared at her, completely stunned. Of course, I loved her. She was the mother of my child, my partner in life. But the idea that she thought I'd ever agree to this, her calmly asking for my blessing to continue this affair, was incomprehensible. I could feel anger rising, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sadness. How had we gotten to this point? How had she convinced herself that I would ever be okay with something like this? I had made up my mind, I would tell Emma about her mother's betrayal. She deserved to know the truth, and if she didn't believe me, well, that was a risk I'd have to take. The thought of Amy going to Hawaii of all places infuriated me. We'd talked about going there as a family for years, but we decided to wait until Emma was older so she could fully appreciate it. And now, before we could even make that dream happen, Amy planned to go there with him. What made it worse was the idea that Emma might have known about her mother's affair. Could she have kept this secret from me? Played a role in hiding Amy's actions? No, surely, that couldn't be true. But the possibility haunted me. How would my 18-year-old daughter even know someone old enough and wealthy enough to fund a trip to Hawaii for Amy? I'd have to figure that out. At least now, I had a name to go on. I replayed Amy's words in my head, words that cut deep. Honey, please don't talk to him about our love life, okay? It makes me feel uncomfortable. Unbelievable. She was the one who started telling me how things supposedly weren't working out, and now she wanted to draw boundaries to protect him. I couldn't sit down and pretend everything was fine. Not with the two of them. After a long day, all I wanted was to be anywhere but at that table with two people I now saw as traitors. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, their eyes darted toward me. For a moment, I thought there might be smug smiles on their faces, though maybe that was just my imagination. Either way, it didn't matter. I knew what they really thought of me. Emma ran up to me like she always did. "Hi, Dad," she said cheerfully, arms outstretched for a hug. But I couldn't do it, not this time. I stood frozen until her embrace ended awkwardly on its own. She pulled back, looking confused, her smile faltering. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I couldn't answer her. Not yet. Instead, I brushed past her and left the room, leaving her standing there, bewildered. Later that night, Amy tried to speak to me, her voice as calm and familiar as ever. "Dan, it's still me," she said softly, trying to meet my gaze. "The woman you've loved all these years. The one who loves you with all her heart. Let me take care of you." I shook my head, the weight of everything too much to bear. "You're not the woman I've loved all these years, Amy," I said, my voice heavy with sorrow. "And that's not the heart you've shared with me. Not as long as there's someone else in your life." She looked at me, stunned into silence, but I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with whatever she chose to feel. "I won't participate in this," I said firmly. "It's that simple. The choice is yours, you can either have him or have me." I waited, hoping for even the faintest flicker of remorse in Amy's eyes, but it never came. Instead, Emma gave me a look that mirrored her mother's, a mixture of exasperation and pity, as if I was being unreasonable for feeling this way. "You know, Dad," she said, her tone calm but dismissive, I introduced them. Her words hit me like a slap. How do you know about this?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. Emma shrugged. "I overheard your conversation with Mom. The day she told you about the Hawaii trip." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend. "And you're okay with this? With everything?" "It's fine, Dad. It's just love." "She doesn't love him," Emma said, as if that explanation would magically make everything better. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" I snapped, my voice rising in frustration. "As if it somehow makes it acceptable. Marriage isn't just about sex and love. It's about trust, respect, and commitment." Emma sighed, like I was a child who just didn't understand. "She's leaving, Dad. And there's nothing you can do about it." Before I could respond, Emma's phone rang, cutting through the tension. I only heard her side of the conversation, but it was enough. "Hello, Mom. How was your trip?" "Sounds great." "No, he's here. But since he knows who it is and that I introduced you, there's no point in hiding. He moved his stuff back into your bedroom as soon as you left. He was bluffing, just like you said. I think he's finally come to terms with it." "Okay, I'll tell him. Love you, Mom." Emma hung up and walked into the living room where I sat, my head in my hands. The casual way she relayed Amy's words twisted the knife deeper. "Dad, I didn't want this," Emma said, her voice suddenly trembling. "Please, Dad, talk to me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stood, brushing past her without a word, and walked into my room. Closing and locking the door behind me, I finally allowed myself to break down. I stayed up all night, gathering what was left of my things. The house didn't feel like mine anymore, it hadn't for a long time. By morning, I had decided to leave. I booked a taxi to the airport instead of asking Rick, a friend, for a ride. I didn't want anyone to try talking me out of it or tell me I was overreacting. Amy returned later that day, and I overheard her talking to Emma. I didn't want to upset him, Amy said casually. Holly told me he moved back into the bedroom, so obviously he's gotten over himself. I didn't want to risk Rick being here when I got back. It would only make things worse. I finally have everything the way I want it, and I don't want to rock the boat. I clenched my fists as I listened from my room, the anger bubbling up once more. When Amy finally came to talk to me, I let her know exactly how I felt. The damage you've done to our family is undeniable, I said coldly. Emma's attitude, the way she so casually dismisses fidelity and marriage as if they're trivial, it's a direct result of your actions. You've poisoned her perception of what love and commitment mean. Amy looked taken aback, but I continued. She's following your example, Amy. And maybe you got it from your mother, too, but the cycle ends here. I doubt Emma will ever have a normal relationship with a man after the example you've set for her. I hope you're proud of that. I paused, my voice thick with bitterness. You've destroyed my trust, and now you've tainted our daughter's future, too. Yes, she's our daughter, but after everything, I wonder if you even think of her that way anymore. Amy didn't reply. She simply stared at me, her face unreadable. But her silence spoke volumes. I didn't share responsibilities, and I wasn't looking for anything permanent, just a little fun. Rick was charming and attentive, and I let myself take the bait. It started innocently enough, finding small reasons to contact him, a casual message here, a shared joke there, just to keep a dialogue going. But things escalated quickly. One day, while Dan was out of town for work, I invited Rick over for dinner. I told myself it was because I was feeling lonely, but deep down, I knew what I was doing. That evening, after dinner, we ended up at his apartment. The night didn't have the tenderness or love that Dan always gave me, but it was thrilling in a way I couldn't explain. I stayed the night, and in the morning, we found ourselves back in bed, repeating everything from the night before. By the time I returned home, the sun was up, and Emma was waiting for me in the living room. She didn't say anything outright, but her expression made it clear she knew I hadn't spent the night at home. Things didn't change much at first. Dan remained the same, and I convinced myself that what I was doing didn't hurt him. I kept waiting for an opportunity to justify my actions, to tell myself that it didn't affect him because he seemed fine. But deep down, I knew better. Rick eventually left town. Things didn't work out between him and Emma, though I doubt that was the only reason he moved on. I'd underestimated how much Dan's love for me meant and what it could withstand, but now it was too late. The love of my life was gone. Still, I'm a resourceful woman, and I've always been determined. I believed I could find Dan and convince him to come back, to see things my way. I told myself I might even have to put things with Rick behind me for good if that's what it took to make amends. The next chapter of my life began in a way I hadn't expected. A few weeks later, I met someone at a coffee shop, a woman who caught my attention immediately. She had long, flowing brown hair and a striking figure. She wasn't wearing a wedding ring, which I noticed as she sat down near me. Finally, she turned in my direction and smiled. "So, are you recently divorced?" she asked casually, "or are you just trying to make people think you're divorced?" Her question took me by surprise, and I gave her a curious look. "Why do you ask?" She pointed to my hand. "Your ring finger has both a tan line and a dent, like you've been wearing a wedding ring until very recently." I smiled, impressed by her sharp observation. "Very insightful. Interesting that you're paying such close attention to my hand." She laughed, and the conversation flowed easily from there. Later that week, I found myself at an upscale Brazilian steakhouse downtown with Michelle, the woman from the coffee shop. I'd been there a few times before, but it was a first for her. She wore an elegant emerald green dress that fell below her knees but revealed just enough at the neckline to make it striking. "You look stunning," I told her as we were seated. She smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Well, thank you, sir. You're looking pretty good yourself." It was a different kind of connection than I was used to, new and unfamiliar, but maybe that was what I needed. I took Michelle's hand and led her to my BMW, opening the door for her like my mother always taught me. As we drove leisurely through the city center, we talked about everything and nothing, letting the conversation flow naturally. It was easy to be with her, no tension, no hidden agendas. At some point, our conversation turned to Emma. "You know," Michelle said thoughtfully, "your daughter might be as much a victim of her mother's influence as you are. She's clearly taken Becky's words to heart, but it seems like she realizes she's gone too far." I nodded, though the thought didn't make it hurt any less. "I agree, but it cut deep. Hearing her talk to me like that, like I was some kind of failure, it broke something in me. Even if her opinion of me was shaped by Becky, it still stings." "Keep the lines of communication open," Michelle urged gently. "Someday, she'll reach out. I'm sure of it." "I hope so," I said with a sigh. "Maybe I'll reach out too. I should show some initiative." Michelle smiled at me. "Good. It sounds like you're ready to start moving forward in more ways than one." The conversation shifted as we continued driving. "So, Michelle," I said, glancing at her, "are you ready to share your story?" "My story?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "Of course," I said with a grin. "Well, I guess there's no better time," she replied with a laugh. "And if I could share it sooner than tomorrow, I probably would." "Good," I said. "I was thinking the same thing." She chuckled and leaned back in her seat. "I'll have to pick up Johnny at 11, though, so it'll need to happen before then." "Fair enough. You know," she added, "I never introduce a guy to my son unless we've been together for at least a month." "And how many guys has Johnny met so far?" I asked playfully. "You'd be the first," she said, flashing a smile. "How about breakfast at my place in the morning?" I offered. "I make a mean omelet." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be there at 8:30. The knock came right on time the next morning, and I appreciated Michelle's punctuality. I opened the door to see her standing there, smiling warmly. Later that day, I got a call from Michael, my closest friend. There was nothing unusual about that, we stayed in regular contact. "What's up, bro?" I asked as I answered the phone. "Just giving you an update on the home front," Michael said. "Becky's been very persistent about trying to get your address. She keeps trying to persuade Fiona to help her, playing the whole woman-to-woman card." I sighed, tension immediately creeping into my shoulders. "And Fiona's not budging," Michael reassured me. "She'd never tell Becky anything, but the calls are coming more and more frequently. It's not anything we can't handle, but Becky seems to be getting more anxious and desperate." "I appreciate you keeping me in the loop," I said, trying to shake off the unease. "Of course," Michael replied. "You've got enough going on. We'll handle this." Later that evening, Michelle and I sat down to dinner. She'd brought over a couple of containers of brisket, potato salad, and a small bottle of barbecue sauce. "I didn't mean to bring drama into dinner," I said as we started eating. "You didn't," Michelle said with a smile. "Besides, we don't know how much time we have to enjoy brisket like this. Let's eat." And so we did, the conversation flowing easily between bites as I let myself feel, for the first time in a long while, a sense of peace. I shared with Michelle all the details of my visit to the lawyer. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "You're being kinder than I would have been capable of," she said after I finished. "Jay and I were only married for 9 years, but I was much tougher about everything when it ended. Do you think you're being too lenient with Becky? That depends on the situation, I replied. But I like that you can see the value in being fair, even now. Later, I found out that Becky received the divorce papers around 9:30 that morning. I didn't pick up her call because I was at work and didn't want to engage with her. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I listened to her voicemail as soon as I had a moment. Her voice was frantic, almost desperate. "Henry, everything is out of control. I destroyed those papers, I won't sign them. We are not getting a divorce. You need to understand that. We need to meet, talk this out, and leave all of this behind us. Call me. Right now." I sighed. Part of me expected this reaction, but hearing her so adamant brought a wave of exhaustion I wasn't prepared for. Michelle noticed my distraction later that evening. "What's on your mind?" she asked as we sat together on her couch. I hesitated, then finally said, "I know Becky is stubborn, but I didn't realize just how unwilling she'd be to let go. It's like she thinks she can still control this outcome." Michelle nodded, understanding in her gaze. "She's trying to hold on to what's already gone. But that doesn't mean you have to let her pull you back into it." The thought of Michelle kept me grounded. I wasn't rushing the divorce just to be rid of Becky, I was doing it to build something new with Michelle. I'd already decided she was worth the wait, and I hoped she felt the same way. "Michelle has a strong will," I confided to my friend Jeff over coffee one day. "I'd never push her to do anything she didn't want to do. If she decides she doesn't want to wait for me to sort this out, I'll respect that. It'll hurt, but I'll understand." Jeff gave me a measured look before grinning slightly. "Well, for now, I approve of her. But you better be ready to prove you're worth the wait." I chuckled. "I'm trying my best." Meanwhile, Becky's own attempts at moving forward weren't faring much better. She tried to set up a meeting with Rick, but he turned her down flat. "I'm not interested anymore," he reportedly told her. "It was only fun because you were married, and I got a kick out of sneaking around. Now that Henry's gone and you're getting a divorce, what's the point?" It stung to know I'd been right about him all along. He wasn't interested in Becky as a person, just in the thrill of breaking boundaries. But the fallout extended beyond Becky. Holly was struggling. She missed me terribly, and despite being close to her mom, there were things she and I had shared that Becky couldn't replicate. It wasn't fair to her. Amid all the turmoil, Michelle remained a source of comfort. One evening, as we walked hand in hand back to her apartment, I could feel the warmth of her presence easing my tension. When we reached the parking lot, she wrapped her arms around me, her scent filling the space between us. At first, it was the floral notes of her perfume, but as it faded, I caught the softer, more natural scent of her skin. It was intoxicating in a way that felt both grounding and exhilarating. We held hands tightly as we walked to her door, the world outside fading into the background. In those moments, I felt like I was finally moving towards something better, leaving the chaos behind. I made a decision as we reached Michelle's apartment. We stopped at her door, and I turned to face her, my heart racing. "Michelle, honey, I need to tell you something," I said softly. She looked up at me with her piercing brown eyes, her hands resting gently behind my neck. "What is it, baby?" she asked, her voice steady yet curious. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I wasn't sure if I was ready to share everything, but the time felt right. Later, a memory of a conversation with Emma surfaced in my mind. She had spoken with such defiance, and I still couldn't shake the sting of her words. "Well," Emma had said, "I told Dean exactly what you told me, that it's perfectly normal for a woman to need a lover because, as men get older, their abilities decrease and women's needs increase." Her explanation outraged me. I couldn't believe Becky had planted such ideas in her head. "And what did Dean say to that?" I had asked, my voice thick with frustration. Emma hesitated before continuing, her tone defiant but tinged with regret. He asked if that meant he could expect the same from me if we got married. I didn't know how to answer, and he just said, "I thought so." Then he broke up with me. Her words left me speechless. It was painful to see the ripple effects of Becky's actions spilling into Emma's relationships. That evening, I was driving with Michelle beside me, her hand resting in mine, while Johnny sat in the back seat. From the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of Johnny's eyes fixed on me, though every time I looked, she was smiling and seemed to be enjoying the ride. We arrived at the restaurant and ordered food before buying game tokens. As soon as we finished, Johnny grabbed my hand with surprising strength and pulled me toward the play area. "Are 8-year-old girls really this strong?" I laughed as she led me into a maze of games and activities. Michelle trailed behind us, smiling at the sight of Johnny's enthusiasm. A few days later, I received a call from my lawyer. "Becky has agreed to sign the papers," he informed me. "She'll come to my office next week. You don't need to be there, but I'll let you know once everything is finalized." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept well. My marriage was finally coming to an end, and the idea felt less like a loss and more like a necessary step forward. Meanwhile, Becky was unraveling. She had confided to someone, or perhaps just to herself, about the depths of her regret. This morning, she'd said, "I was ready to fight him to the end." But as I watched Holly spend another day in her room crying because Dean left her, I realized all of this is causing her too much pain. And where will it lead me? In the end, I'll still get divorced. She paused, then continued with a bitter laugh. "I think it's Wednesday, but to be honest, I've lost track. I've been getting drunk and going home with different men every night since last Friday, when I finally decided to give in and sign the papers. Luckily, the last few guys were better than the first one, so at least I was able to drown my sorrows. But today, if I've got the day right, I'm supposed to sign those papers. And once I do, I don't know what I'll do without Henry. I love him so much. I just needed something more for a while." Her words were full of sadness, but they were also a stark reminder of the choices that had led us here. I didn't hate her, but the person she'd become was no longer the woman I married. Holly's perspective on everything left me bewildered. It seemed like her happiness stemmed from seeing her mother fulfilled in a way she believed was essential for women. She didn't view Becky's choices as betrayal but as an inevitable rite of passage, a necessity for women as they aged. Becky had framed taking a lover as something natural, almost expected, and Holly had accepted it without question. Though Holly supported her mother's decisions, I wanted to believe she still cared for me in her own way. Yet her happiness for Becky came at the expense of seeing me humiliated. Whether she realized it or not, her support hurt. Looking back, perhaps the whole ordeal could have been resolved without the trip to Hawaii. But I had been reckless, speaking openly about things that should have remained private. Now here I sat, a glass of wine perpetually in my hand, or occasionally on the nightstand, trying to process it all. Meanwhile, Becky's spiral continued. She drank heavily, often coming home late or not at all. Holly told me about strange men dropping her off at night, and how their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Malone, sometimes had to take Becky to retrieve her car the next day. "She's not herself, Dad," Holly admitted one day, her voice trembling. "Half the time, she's drunk. And when she's not, she's, I don't know, distant. Like she's not even here." My chest tightened as Holly's words painted a grim picture. "Does she bring men into the house?" I asked, my voice low but filled with tension. Holly hesitated before answering. "No, not that I've seen. But it's still unsettling." I felt a wave of anger, not for Becky but for Holly. No matter how much resentment I held toward Becky, I didn't want my daughter exposed to such chaos. Holly didn't deserve to feel unsafe in her own home. That was the turning point for me. Becky needed help, whether she admitted it or not. I began researching rehab centers, visiting several before settling on one that seemed promising. Treatment was voluntary, and I hoped we could convince her to go. It was a long and grueling journey. Becky's recovery took years, and there were moments I doubted she would ever pull through. But eventually, she did. She started putting her life back together, though by then, our paths had irrevocably diverged. 7 years later, I stood at the back of a church, preparing to walk Holly down the aisle. She was marrying Dean, her boyfriend of 4 years, and the sight of her in her wedding dress brought tears to my eyes. As I watched her adjust her veil, my mind wandered to the past. It hadn't been easy for either of us, but we'd made it through. Michelle and I were still happily married, and Johnny, now 15, idolized her older sister. When the music began and Holly took my arm, I felt a surge of pride and gratitude. Life had brought us through storms I never thought we'd survive, but here we were, together, stronger, and ready for the future.